DC Dual Force is just weeks away, and I've already seen a decent amount of Marvel Snap versus DC Dual Force rhetoric. And to be clear, I don't like these conversations. I understand the drive to compare the two. I understand where that comes from, but I'm a person who intends to play both Marvel Snap and DC Dual Force, and comparing the two can be interesting, but I feel like a lot of the comparisons are done in a disheartful way. I love Marvel Snap as it currently is, and I have very high hopes for the unreleased Dual Force, and what we already know about the game is incredibly promising. As much as I would like to avoid conversations like this, that's not going to stop people asking me questions, whether it be in Twitch chat, in videos, in Discord, about the two games and what I think about the differences. I'm going to answer as many of those questions as possible in this video. That way I don't have to continue to have the same conversation over again. I can just point to this video and be like, hey, if you want to know my thoughts about Marvel Snap versus DC Dual Force, go watch this video and you'll have a better understanding about how I feel about it. I just don't like having these conversations, so I'm just going to have the one conversation the one time and then move on. So I'll say it as clear as day right now. I'm a Marvel Snap player for life. I love the game as it is, and I don't see a future where I'm not playing the game in some shape or form. And while DC Dual Force isn't out yet, I have very high hopes for the game. The people behind the game know what they're doing, and it's a lifelong dream of mine to have a DC digital card game because I love card games and I love DC. There's been DC physical card games, and I've enjoyed those, but it's really hard for me to enjoy a physical card game just because I live in such a remote area. So for me to be really able to sink my teeth into a card game, it needs to be digital. Despite my love for both of these two games, this video is all about comparing the two. So let's do it. Let's start with Marvel Snap. Marvel Snap is a mobile-first game. A lot of the decision-making, a lot of the core design philosophy of the game is built around the fact that it is a mobile game. Games are nice and fast. There are 12 card decks, just one card type. You know, there's no spells, minions, field spells, trinkets, whatever. There's just cards. Marvel Snap games last 1 to 7 turns. Technically, it can be up to 1 to 9 if you count Kang resets and then also Limbo, but the typical game is 1 to 6 turns, and already that sounds good, but really, the 1 to 6 turn timer, or what I've got written on this graphic, the 1 to 7 turn timer, is actually more like 3 turns because the traditional card game would have those turns be separate, but Marvel Snap has simultaneous turns, so the pacing of 6 turns feels more like 3 turns. There's no packs in Marvel Snap, instead you collect cards in a very unique way. There's no combat or damage calculation the player has to do in Marvel Snap. DC Dual Force is PC first. There's actually no announcement of a mobile version of the game, but I would be absolutely shocked if Dual Force does not intend to release on mobile. Though, like I said, currently PC is the only announced platform as is, and that's where the game will initially release. They haven't confirmed this, but there's 40 card decks in DC Dual Force. This is based on an early prototype design document that we have access to, or that we had access to. They've actually taken that document down, so I won't show you the document because I took my video down covering that same document because obviously they don't want it out there because they took it down. So I won't share that with you, but I will let you know that there are 40 card decks. There are 3 different card types in DC Dual Force. Previously, they were called leaders, minions, and actions, but now we know that they're called leaders, recruits, and I assume that they're still called actions, but I guess we technically don't know that for sure. But there are 3 card types. There's no cap on the number of turns you can have in a DC Dual Force game. Games end with one player losing both of their leaders. You control 2 different leaders in Dual Force, and as soon as you've lost both of them, you lose the game. DC Dual Force has packs. There are other ways to acquire cards, and we'll talk about that probably sometime in the future in a new video, but for now, just know that there are packs in the game, so it's closer to like a traditional card game monetization system, though there's a little bit more in there, and again, we'll talk about that in the future. And then lastly, DC Dual Force has a combat system, so already just between these surface level differences, you can see that the games are wildly different. One thing we didn't even mention on the Dual Force side is that Dual Force has this upgrade system where if you play a card, it upgrades itself and you get access to a stronger version of it. Already, that's another unique mechanic that is completely separating the two. Marvel Snap's version of that would be something like locations, right? That's a very unique gameplay mechanic that is specific to Marvel Snap that you won't see in other digital card games. And of course, there are plenty more things that we could mention that separate the two of these games. Holistically, though, I would say Marvel Snap is designed to be as approachable as possible. Very fundamentally, they looked at what card games are. They've stripped away everything that is unnecessary, and then they added some unique mechanics on top of it to give themselves an identity. And that identity was locations and the cube system. If I had to sum up both games in a single sentence, it would look something like this. I'd say Marvel Snap is a card game whose target audience is people who haven't played card games before. It's trying to acquire a new audience that would otherwise perhaps not be interested in the genre, while still maintaining enough of the genre's core identity to still intrigue a traditional card game player. And DC Dual Force, I would say, is a traditional card game whose target audience is card game players while still being approachable enough to entice new players who otherwise wouldn't play the genre. Everything I just said isn't supposed to be as black and white as it sounds. Of course, Marvel Snap appeals to card game players. I'm a card game player. I play Marvel Snap. And of course, Dual Force will appeal to non-card game players. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of DC fans who want to play the game who haven't played a card game before. In fact, Dual Force is more approachable than it seems. I mean, even though the mechanics are perhaps maybe quote-unquote more in-depth than Marvel Snap, you'll have an easier onboarding process because the game's systems should be introduced to you very smoothly, because I'm sure they're going to try to integrate you into PvE first of all. I mean, if you're really overwhelmed by Dual Force's depth of systems, you don't even ever have to play PvP. You could exclusively stick to PvE if you want to, because that mode sounds really robust. I feel like the average player probably doesn't even need to ever play PvP, but obviously that's to be determined, and we'll have to wait and see how much content is actually in PvE. I want to be clear though, neither of these approaches are bad. Focusing on the mobile experience and targeting new players is fantastic. That's great. Focusing on a rich PvE experience and targeting a slightly different demographic or a slightly different audience, that's also great. But they are very dramatically different approaches, and because of that, I expect the audience of both games to be fairly different, if not literally just because of the lengths of games. Marvel Snap games are very, very fast. Dual Force games will not be fast, especially because compared to the first time we saw the game and the most recent time we saw the game, the defense values of leaders have gone up pretty dramatically. So games might even go longer than what we thought they would originally. I also see, every so often I see someone on Twitter or something say, you know, DC copied Marvel by, they saw them doing a card game and they said, well, we got to get a slice of that pie. And if the previous part of this video where we specifically discuss just how different these two games are didn't manage to convince you, let's go over the timeline really quickly just because I think it's important to have out there. DC Dual Force was originally revealed back in 2021, so quite a long time ago. Now, from what I understand, part of Cryptozoic Entertainment has broken off into CCG Labs, and now that company is now running the project. I'm not exactly sure what that transition looked like. I'm not exactly sure if CCG Labs has any connection to Cryptozoic anymore. I legitimately have no idea. So I'm not going to begin to speculate on that. For now, we know that Cryptozoic were previously developing it, and now CCG Labs is. And from what I understand, some of CCG Labs' staff is made up of previous Cryptozoic staff. Again, I don't know what that process looked like, but that's what the before and after is. This process is probably what delayed the game from their original goal. They originally planned to launch in Q3 of 2022, which is, again, their original goal. That transition process that we just talked about, that was probably what delayed the game for so long. Marvel Snap, on the other hand, was announced 6 months later in April of 2022. So DC Dual Force was actually announced well and truly before Marvel Snap was. Now, technically, that's not the full story. Second Dinner revealed back in 2019 that they were working on a Marvel game, and given that the chief development officer is Ben Brode, it was a pretty safe guess that that game was going to be a card game. So if you were really intent on saying Dual Force copied Marvel Snap, you could say some guy at Warner Brothers saw the video on Second Dinner's channel and decided that they needed to invest a bunch of resources and money into a project to attempt to compete with Marvel for a game that at this point was going to be first to market anyway, which quite frankly sounds absurd. Realistically, the two games are entirely separate from each other from concept to execution, but because they both feature cards and they both feature superheroes, the comparisons are, well, inevitable. And unfortunately, the average person is always going to assume DC Dual Force was a response to Marvel Snap, but I think it's pretty reasonable based on the information we've laid out in this video that that was almost certainly not the case. Maybe there's some possible way, like maybe some behind the scenes info jumped ahead, but again, I think that idea is absurd. But at the end of the day, Marvel Snap released in 2022, and Dual Force is going to release in 2023. And even though acquiring funding for the game, designing the game, developing the game, and launching a free-to-play card game for both PvE and PvP in that 12-month window is essentially impossible, people are always going to think that Dual Force was some type of response to Snap. I don't even blame the average person for thinking that, because the average person doesn't pay attention to this stuff. But it's a little sad to see media outlets fall into that trap. In conclusion, though, if you like the fast-paced games of Snap, leveraging cubes, and the high variance that games offer with things like locations, then Snap is for you. If you like individual games to be a tad more important, a tad more meaningful, and as a consequence of that, maybe they're going to be a bit longer, there's going to be more card types, larger decks, there's going to be PvE, perhaps PvE is a big draw for you, then Dual Force is probably more for you. Or perhaps you just like card games and you just like superheroes, in which case both games are probably for you. All right, well, with that, I'm going to sign off and never talk about Snap versus DC Dual Force ever again. Keep being awesome, and I'll catch you in the next one.